What was the situationship when she told you she was pregnant? Because she's trying to trap you and she's desperate to be with you.
Mr. Brown have bought not one thing that you can think of. Everything came out of my pocket. We was friends. We was cordial. Like, I was doing stuff for you. You was doing stuff for me and my kids. One go right. From the first night when we had sex, we didn't use a condom. Every day we had
sex or unprotected?
We had unprotected sex.
All right.
Time, not one time did we use a condom.
Also sleeping with other people.
Yeah, that could be the case.
Just having sex for sport or what?
Yeah, that's what it
basically.
was.
But basically, we was friends. No, don't even. We was friends. We been best of friends until.
The type of person I am. That's. I mean,
you're just kind-hearted.
Yeah, I'm a kind-hearted person. That's the type of person I am.
You just having sex and he's helping you take care of your kids.
Yes, basically.
That's new, Ron. That's new. What was the situationship when she told you she was pregnant?
He left.
The courtroom opens under an atmosphere shaped by tension, unspoken regret, and the unsettling awareness that every person seated inside carries a version of the truth they hope will survive the next few minutes. Judge Lauren Lake presides with calm authority, the kind of presence that reminds everyone that the relationship between law and justice is never simple, and nothing here depends on emotion, only on evidence. As the session begins, families enter not as witnesses of harmony, but as representatives of fractured trust, unfinished stories, and consequences that now must be untangled through legal process. At the center of today's proceedings is a young mother seeking recognition, support, and validation. She walks in holding months of emotional exhaustion on her shoulders, balancing her hope for fairness with the reality that the father of her twins refuses to believe what she insists is certain. Opposite her stands the alleged father, guarded and frustrated, convinced that he has been manipulated into a situation he never wanted. The air between them is thick with accusation and disbelief. Their past, which once felt casual and undefined, has collapsed into legal dispute, and now stands before Judge Lake to be dismantled and examined. Judge Lauren Lake begins by clarifying why the court is convened. The mother has filed a paternity suit, seeking financial contribution for child-rearing expenses and recognition of biological responsibility. She explains that she has been raising the twins alone, relying only on her parents and her own limited resources. In her voice, there is urgency mingled with quiet anger, both born from long nights caring for infants without support. Her words paint a picture of a life overwhelmed by diapers, formula, medical appointments, and exhaustion. She explains that one of the twins has been diagnosed as deaf, requiring specialized care, including sign language classes, hearing assessments, and expensive medical procedures. As she speaks, the courtroom senses how deeply she feels the absence of the alleged father. She recounts how he blocked her entire family during the pregnancy, her number, her mother, her sister, sometimes even blocking and unblocking in emotional volatility. She insists she tried every avenue to notify him, even messaging his mother in desperation. The courtroom absorbs her story as more than an argument. It becomes a testimony about abandonment, fear, and survival. The alleged father responds with his own narrative, shaped by doubt and suspicion. He insists the mother misled him from the beginning, claiming she gave him medical paperwork suggesting she could not have children. Judge Lake listens but questions the logic behind placing such trust in casual relationship dynamics. He argues that because the mother had sex with him on the first night, he assumed she might be doing the same with others. He uses superficial details, eyebrows, hairline shapes, hereditary guesses, to justify his doubt. Judge Lake challenges the weakness of this reasoning, directing the courtroom back to the legal importance of evidence and the scientific clarity of a DNA test. She stresses that people often regret taking DNA tests not because of the result, but because the test removes every illusion and replaces it with a fact that will redefine their lives. The courtroom becomes a stage where truth is about to be revealed, a truth that neither side can manipulate once the envelope is opened. The discussion shifts to the concept of justice in jurisprudence, with Judge Lake reflecting on how emotion, morality, and legal obligations collide in family disputes. She reminds the courtroom that parenthood is not a favor or a personal preference. It is a legal and ethical duty. She references how in many Supreme Court child support judgments, biological confirmation immediately triggers financial responsibility regardless of personal disagreements or the nature of the original relationship. The mother then presents receipts, physical evidence printed, organized, and stored. She has cataloged everything: baby essentials, formula purchases, medical appointments, strollers, and the projected medical costs for her deaf child, estimated at nearly $250,000 over time. Judge Lake acknowledges the staggering burden and emphasizes how the Evidence Act prioritizes tangible proof over speculation. She also highlights how adverse inference arises when someone refuses to participate or provide information, allowing the court to conclude that the withheld information might have been unfavorable to them. Though the father did not refuse DNA testing, his long pattern of avoidance reflects a similar emotional retreat. As descriptions of blocked calls, disappearing support, and ongoing hardship unfold, the courtroom absorbs the emotional weight. The young mother stands not just as a litigant, but as a witness to how fragile a human connection can be when tested by real-life responsibilities. Despite being only in her 20s, she has been forced into a single-parent role that few people her age expect or feel equipped to handle. There is also a deeper layer often explored in the Game-Changing Attorney podcast and similar legal discussions: how personal choices intersect with the law, leaving people shocked when the legal consequences override emotional narratives. Judge Lake embodies this intersection, often reminding litigants that the courtroom is not a place for emotional retaliation, but a place where the law translates evidence into obligations. As the mother grows emotional recounting her challenges, Judge Lake allows space for her pain but keeps her anchored in the necessity of the legal process. She clarifies that financial responsibility is not optional and cannot be negotiated away by personal conflict. The courtroom absorbs this with quiet recognition. Truth, whether welcomed or not, always brings accountability. When the results arrive, the courtroom falls into a hush. DNA test results are a kind of judgment beyond human reasoning, a scientific conclusion that ends speculation. Judge Lake reads them slowly, aware of the gravity. When she announces that the alleged father is indeed the biological father, the mother sighs in vindication while the father's face shifts from disbelief to a reluctant acknowledgement. The truth has arrived, immovable and undeniable. The entire tone of the courtroom changes. Uncertainty is replaced with obligation. Judge Lake then orders the father to pay the $1,000 in child-rearing expenses. She informs him that he now possesses both responsibility and rights: the legal right to see his children and the legal obligation to support them. She reminds him that parenthood is not about convenience. It is about consistency, compassion, and accountability. As the session concludes, both sides leave carrying new truths. One leaves with the validation she desperately needed, and the other leaves carrying the weight of a future he tried to avoid, now shaped by undeniable biological reality. Yet the courtroom does not quiet for long. New litigants emerge, bringing new conflicts shaped by relationships complicated by cheating, secrets, and disputed paternity. Judge Lake prepares for the next case, one involving a woman who had multiple partners, including a separated husband and boyfriends, and whose child's father remains uncertain. The tension shifts once again. illustrating how modern relationships often unravel into legal challenges that force everyone involved to confront facts they tried to ignore. Judge Lake listens as the next mother and alleged father share their histories, full of half-truths, arguments, and accusations. The alleged father explains how he received a text message while the mother was in labor, claiming the child was not his. He describes the emotional burden, wanting to be present, wanting to believe, but constantly receiving messages telling him not to. This man exhibits the emotional damage often discussed in cheating stories, adoption stories, and episodes of the Divorce Course podcast. A mixture of love, betrayal, and fear amplified by uncertainty about fatherhood. His voice trembles when he explains how deeply he wanted a daughter, especially after losing his mother at age 14. To love a child who might not be biologically yours is an emotional weight the courtroom recognizes instantly. Judge Lake allows him space to express this pain, highlighting how courtroom paternity cases often collide with personal trauma and emotional history. The mother insists he is the father, presenting her own evidence and a DNA test proving that another man is not the biological father. Yet the father remains doubtful. He reminds the court that cheating destroys trust and that repeated accusations and mixed messages have left him emotionally drained. Judge Lake acknowledges that trust cannot be legislated, only facts can. When the DNA test reveals he is not the father, the courtroom is overtaken by emotional quiet. The man breaks down, still declaring he will stay in the child's life, proving that while biology defines legal responsibility, it cannot control the heart. This moment becomes a testament to something often heard in Celebrate Recovery testimonies: pain, loss, and resilience shaping a person's emotional growth. But the session continues into further testing for another child, and once again, Judge Lake brings the courtroom back to the foundations of truth, responsibility, and justice. The emotional weight from the previous cases still lingers in the room, as though the walls themselves have absorbed the heartache of every parent, partner, and child who has stood before Judge Lauren Lake. But the courtroom cannot pause to process grief. Instead, it moves forward into its next story, another fragile situation shaped by confusion, betrayal, and unanswered questions. The lingering echo of broken trust becomes the background for another unfolding conflict. The next couple enters carrying a different kind of tension, less anger, more uncertainty, and a deep exhaustion that appears etched into the alleged father's expression. He is burdened not just by doubt, but by grief from his past, still mourning the loss of his mother who died when he was 14. He walks into the courtroom with emotional history trailing him like a shadow. The mother enters with an air of defensive confidence, determined to prove what she believes is true. Together, they bring a story defined by complicated relationships, questionable decisions, and the hope for final clarity. Both are tethered by the presence of two young children whose paternity is in dispute. The father describes how deeply he loved the first child, the toddler who calls him daddy, who runs to him with unquestioning affection, whose giggles became the highlight of his life. He speaks of how this daughter reminds him of his mother, both in features and in spirit, and how he had built his emotional healing around the bond they shared. The courtroom feels the weight of his words. The connection he describes is more than biological. It is spiritual, emotional, and profoundly personal. The mother, however, carries her own truth. She insists she knows the biological reality with certainty, explaining that she had already tested another man, a previous partner, whose DNA test proved he was not the father. She presents this as evidence to ease the father's fear, believing it should close the door on doubt. Judge Lake listens attentively, carefully considering the mother's confidence, while also reminding the courtroom that emotional conviction is not evidence. Only the test results matter. The father explains how difficult it has been to live with doubt. He describes receiving messages from strangers claiming they are the child's father, messages sent at moments when his commitment should have brought joy, such as during the mother's labor. The courtroom senses how deeply these intrusions wounded him. For him, fatherhood has become a battlefield, with conflicting stories and emotional traps pulling him in opposite directions. Judge Lake acknowledges the psychological impact of such experiences, relating them to broader legal conversations explored in podcasts like Truth Changes Everything, the Divorce Course podcast, and the Game Changing Attorney podcast, where attorneys discuss how emotional instability can influence decision-making during legal disputes. This reflection helps the courtroom understand the intricate psychological toll of paternity uncertainty. As the judge prepares the courtroom for the first set of results, the mother appears confident, convinced that the truth aligns with her belief. But the father trembles visibly, anxious, shaken, overwhelmed by what the envelope might destroy or preserve. Judge Lake reads the results with her usual calm authority. When it becomes clear that the father is not the biological parent of the daughter he adored, the courtroom is consumed by grief. The father cries, expressing that nothing will change his love for the child. The courtroom absorbs his pain, understanding that legal truth can never erase emotional truth. Judge Lake handles the moment with empathy but firmness, reminding everyone that even though the test determines biology, the emotional bond is something the law cannot govern. His decision to remain in the child's life is voluntary, not mandated, and she encourages him to support the child emotionally if he chooses to continue that bond. But the session does not end there. There is a second child, a younger infant whose paternity also remains uncertain. The father explains how the same doubts plague this second situation. He recounts receiving messages shortly after the baby's birth, claiming he was not the father, followed by instances where the mother allegedly used the child to provoke emotional reactions during arguments. Judge Lake reminds both parties that using emotional leverage with a child as the weapon is an abuse of trust, not a parenting strategy. The mother insists she is certain the father is biologically connected to the second child, asserting there is no possibility of anyone else. But her previous admission of infidelity, the presence of multiple partners during prior periods, and contradictory statements influence the courtroom's understanding of the situation. Even though she insists there was no cheating during the conception window for the second child, her earlier behaviors cast doubt. Judge Lake, drawing from jurisprudence and principles of the relationship between law and justice, clarifies that personal morality often complicates legal battles. What matters is clarity, biological truth, not what someone wishes were true. As she prepares to read the second test, the courtroom senses an energy shift. The father braces for impact, hoping for a different outcome this time. The mother anxiously waits, fearing that another devastating truth might unravel her life. When Judge Lake reveals that the father again is not the biological parent, the mother breaks down, and the father collapses emotionally for the second time in one day. Judge Lake's voice becomes solemn as she addresses both. She asks the mother whether she has any idea who the biological father might be. Her answer is vague. She claims she does not know, cannot recall the details of that period, and seems overwhelmed by the revelation. Judge Lake expresses concern for the children, emphasizing that misinformation and uncertainty can cause lifelong emotional harm. She encourages the mother to be honest with herself and committed to identifying the biological fathers to prevent future emotional crises. The mother, still crying, expresses regret and shock. The father, broken but composed, expresses loss not for biology but for the moments he shared with the second child. The feeding, holding, comforting, providing, all under the belief he was raising his own son. He outlines the things he purchased: a crib, toys, clothing, necessities he provided willingly. The courtroom recognizes his pain as a mixture of heartbreak and betrayal. Judge Lake notes that this is why DNA test people regret taking, not because the results are wrong, but because the results redefine relationships permanently. She emphasizes that DNA testing is the most reliable form of biological evidence and an essential tool in the evidence stage in divorce case scenarios, where clarity is necessary before legal decisions about custody or support can be made. She also explains how the adverse inference in evidence act can apply in cases where people deliberately avoid DNA testing or obstruct truth-seeking, though this particular case did not involve refusal, only emotional complexity. Despite the pain, Judge Lake moves forward with professionalism. She advises the father that he may still remain in the children's lives if he chooses, but he is under no legal obligation. She warns the mother that concealing or confusing paternity not only creates legal challenges, but causes emotional damage to children who will eventually learn the truth. The courtroom atmosphere becomes heavier. These stories, full of heartbreak, regret, betrayal, reflect themes often heard in Celebrate Recovery testimonies or deep interview segments on serious podcasts, where individuals describe how truth reshaped their lives. For both parents standing before Judge Lake, this day becomes a dividing line: life before the truth and life after. As the session progresses, the conversation shifts to the responsibility of parents to create stability for their children. Judge Lake discusses how courts, especially at the Supreme Court child support level, always prioritize the child's welfare over the emotional turmoil of adults. She emphasizes that healing must begin not with blame but with clarity, accountability, and a commitment to honest parenting. The mother stands silently, absorbing the gravity of the judge's words. The father remains heartbroken but calmer, recognizing that clarity, even painful clarity, is better than uncertainty. Judge Lake reminds him that he showed exceptional integrity by stepping up when he believed the children were his. His actions reflect the kind of responsible parenting the law seeks to encourage, even when biology does not align with intention. The courtroom gradually steadies, preparing to move into closing remarks. As both parties absorb their new realities, Judge Lake reflects broadly on the emotional weight these cases carry. She notes how often people come into court hoping the law will soothe emotional wounds, when in truth, the law only reveals facts. It cannot repair the relationships behind them. Emotions must be healed outside the courtroom. Before concluding this portion of the session, she reminds everyone listening, those present physically, and those who might later hear these stories through legal commentary, podcasts, or educational discussions, that the pursuit of truth always has consequences. It can heal, but it can also destroy. It can bring clarity, but also pain. Yet truth remains essential because justice cannot function without it. As the courtroom prepares for its next case, the echo of emotional truth lingers. The judge adjusts her paperwork, preparing to continue into yet another complex story of relationships fractured by confusion, biology, and unmet expectations. The courtroom transitions once again, shifting into the final story of the day, a case where doubt and pain collide with legal procedure. Judge Lauren Lake maintains her disciplined presence, reflecting the unwavering balance between compassion and justice she brings to each case. The atmosphere is heavy and layered with emotional residue from the previous paternity revelations. Yet the courtroom must continue its work, recognizing that every person entering carries another fragile reality in need of truth. The next mother and alleged father step into the space with a mixture of nervousness and guarded tension. Their relationship appears bruised by betrayal, arguments, and mistrust, but unlike earlier couples, they share not just one child in question but two, each carrying emotional ties, memories, and unresolved questions about parenthood. The mother stands with quiet determination, insisting that the man beside her is the father of both children. The father, however, walks in burdened by uncertainty, carrying within him the silent grief of earlier betrayals and the agonizing fear of losing a connection he cherishes deeply. The courtroom senses his emotional exhaustion. He describes how his first child with the mother was a source of healing in his life, a living memory that resembled his late mother. He recounts childhood promises he made to himself, promising to be the kind of father who would never leave, the kind of father he once lost. The mother insists there is no other possibility for paternity, presenting her belief as unwavering truth. She draws from her own understanding of the timeline, her own recollection of intimacy, and the DNA tests she performed with others to eliminate other potential fathers. Judge Lauren Lake sits with the meticulous posture of a judge, prepared to make a ruling grounded in evidence. She emphasizes that feelings cannot override biological truth, explaining that the law relies on findings, not memories. Her tone remains consistent with a principle often referenced in legal discussions and platforms like the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, that justice requires objectivity, even when emotions cloud perception. As the courtroom relives the past events through their testimonies, the father explains how deeply conflicted he felt during the mother's pregnancy. He shares the moments he supported her, the emotional investments he made, and the fears that accompanied them. He recalls receiving messages from another man claiming he was the real father of the child. He recounts how these messages arrived at pivotal moments, amplifying his doubts and poisoning his sense of stability. Every new accusation and every new rumor widened the distance between trust and truth. The mother admits there were moments when she, in anger or frustration, lashed out at him with words that cut deeply, claiming he was not the father, saying things intended to hurt him when arguments escalated. Judge Lake recognizes this as a familiar pattern in many modern relationships where anger becomes a weapon and words become instruments of emotional destruction. She explains that these emotional injuries often find their way into legal disputes, complicating factual evaluations with layers of psychological trauma. With care, Judge Lake returns the courtroom to the guiding principle of truth. In jurisprudence, establishing biological paternity is not only about confirming responsibility, it is also about eliminating uncertainty so that courts can establish custody, support, and parental rights without ambiguity. She notes that the relationship between law and justice depends on clarity, something only scientific evidence can provide when conflicting testimonies drown common sense. The court moves into the reading of results for the second child, a moment dense with tension. Even though the father's heart is heavy from the first result revealing he was not the father of the eldest child, part of him still holds onto hope. Hope that at least one of the children he has raised and cared for is biologically his. Hope that his emotional investment aligns with biological truth. Hope that he has not been living a second lie. When Judge Lake reveals that he is not the father of the second child either, a hush overtakes the courtroom. The revelation sinks into their bodies like a weight none of them can easily carry. The father breaks, overwhelmed by the realization that the children he loved, provided for, and emotionally invested in do not share his DNA. His grief fills the space with something heavier than loss. It is the grief of being emotionally tied to a story that biology does not confirm. The mother reacts with shock, disappointment, and confusion. Her confidence evaporates, replaced by despair and panic. She insists she did not expect this outcome and cannot identify another potential father. Her lack of clarity becomes another layer of distress in an already painful situation. Judge Lake looks at her sternly, stressing the importance of identifying the correct biological father, especially for the long-term emotional well-being of the children. The judge emphasizes that failing to take responsibility for understanding the truth leads to generational confusion, emotional instability, and deep psychological wounds. Judge Lake speaks directly to the mother about accountability, how concealing, ignoring, or misinterpreting sexual timelines creates impossible legal situations, leaving children unanchored and men traumatized. She warns her that the consequences of ignoring truth are far heavier than the consequences of confronting it. The judge's words reflect themes often heard in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where honesty becomes the first step toward healing. The father attempts to gather himself, expressing devastation, yet also acknowledging the love he genuinely felt for the children. He describes the toys he bought, the crib he assembled, the nights he stayed awake caring for them. These are not gestures someone can erase with a DNA result. They are memories imprinted on a man's heart. Judge Lake acknowledges this truth, stating that biology does not define emotional impact. At the same time, she clarifies that the law cannot assign paternal responsibility where DNA does not confirm it. As the courtroom processes the emotional fallout, Judge Lake transitions into a broader reflection on the purpose of the legal system in family courts. She explains that paternity cases are not simply about revealing genetic links. They are about establishing accountability, protecting children from uncertainty, and preventing emotional manipulation. She references how the Evidence Act emphasizes evidence-based rulings, especially in situations involving adverse inference, timelines of intimacy, and disputed biological claims. She reiterates how DNA testing has become a crucial tool in modern jurisprudence, often discussed on platforms like Truth Changes Everything podcast, because it provides clarity that human memory often fails to offer. She explains how many people regret taking DNA tests, not because the test is wrong, but because truth carries consequences, particularly in relationships tangled by betrayal. The courtroom shifts to considering next steps. Judge Lake advises the mother that moving forward, she must take proactive responsibility to identify the biological fathers so the children can have clarity about their heritage, their medical history, and their rights. She stresses that the uncertainty the children currently face cannot be allowed to follow them into adulthood, as the emotional impact could be severe. The father, still grieving, listens quietly. Judge Lake acknowledges his pain and honors the emotional labor he has invested. She reminds him that his grief is valid, his commitment admirable, and his character honorable. She encourages him to seek emotional support, recognizing that losing emotional parenthood is one of the most painful forms of heartbreak. As the session reaches its final moments, Judge Lake's tone becomes reflective and firm. She explains how courts are forced to confront the consequences of adult decisions, casual relationships, careless intimacy, dishonesty, and unaddressed trauma. She warns all parents, present and future litigants, that paternity issues are not simply about who slept with whom, but about the emotional lives of children who deserve stability, certainty, and honesty. She concludes by reminding the courtroom that justice is not always comfortable. Justice reveals, clarifies, and corrects, even when the truth is painful. In cases shaped by emotional confusion and biological uncertainty, justice relies on DNA to draw boundaries between belief and fact. As the litigants leave, the courtroom quiets once more. The emotional residue remains, a mixture of heartbreak, clarity, unanswered questions, and the heavy responsibility of moving forward after truth has been revealed. Judge Lauren Lake gathers her files, preparing for the next case, knowing that every story she hears, every tear shed in her courtroom, becomes another example of how fragile human connection is when confronted with undeniable truth. The session ends with an unspoken message echoing through the courtroom. Truth changes everything.